All right, so today we are talking about, we're still in our Cold War unit, and this is kind of our last lesson for this first half of the Cold War. This is going to get us to 1960. And today we're looking at kind of the global impact, if you will, the political end of the Cold War, and looking at kind of two nations living on the edge, looking at this idea of brinkmanship, the CIA, and the space race. Okay, and today the biggest thing to keep in mind is, as we've been talking about, fear is rampant at this time, right? So fear is the driving force. We talked about this the other day, and things that like we nowadays take for granted come out of this time of fear. One of the things is like drills, safety drills. So one of the drills that they would do like nuclear fallout drills, where kind of like duck and cover like we do for earthquakes, except for they were supposed to lay kind of like in a fetal position under their desk, these being students. And the idea was that they were sheltering kind of under their desk. But the reality that nobody wanted to tell the children was that they were having them arrange themselves in this way so that they were easier to identify after the fact. So whoever survived could come and find the remains, and the bodies would already be lined up. It's terrible, it's sad, but that was the mindset. This is also the time when it became popular for kids to wear dog tags, even though they weren't military. It really had nothing to do with the popularity of the military. It was really a safety measure of, if we had a nuclear fallout, if the Soviet Union attacks us, in theory, the dog tags would survive the attack, and then we could identify the remains and be able to tell who was who. So keep that in mind. This kind of fear is overwhelming in the country, and as it should. If this kind of fear is that prevalent among the people, it's going to impact society and the politics in society. So here we go. Let's get started here. So the first topic we're looking at is brinkmanship, okay? And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But the first thing, we talked last time about the Soviets obtaining the bomb. So they got the atom bomb. If you remember, we talked about it when we talked about the Rosenbergs, right? So the Soviets exploded the atom bomb about 3 to 5 years sooner than American scientists thought they would. And what this started was this need for a bigger bomb. And so atom bomb scientists, both in the Soviet Union and the United States, were convinced that they could make a more powerful bomb using a thermonuclear reaction instead of a nuclear one. And again, this isn't a science class, but something that you need to understand is that thermonuclear reactions are fusion. So it's taking two atoms and making them into a larger atom. Nuclear reactions are fission. You're separating, you're taking one atom and you're splitting it, right? And so the idea was that by combining two atoms, in this case of hydrogen, you could make an explosion that was approximately 67 times more powerful than the bomb dropped in Hiroshima. Now, of course, this was all theoretical, but there was this idea that they could make it happen. And so a lot of questions were raised about whether this kind of weapon was moral. You've seen the pictures. I've shown you guys pictures of the damage and the end result of the bomb at Hiroshima and at Nagasaki. And the idea of making a bomb 67 times more powerful raised a lot of questions about morality. Was it moral for this kind of weapon to exist? Was it ethical to use this kind of weapon? What would you even use this kind of weapon for? But as is the case with most people who ask logical questions during the Cold War, they pretty much get ignored. And instead, this race to produce the bomb kicks off. And I don't know if you really want to say that they won, but the U.S. wins the race November 1st, 1952, when they explode the world's first H-bomb, or hydrogen bomb, near Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Now, the Bikini Atoll is a place. An atoll is a series of kind of islands that form a circle. They're not even really, they're kind of all linked together. They form a circle with water in the center, right? So it's like it's like almost like a donut island, right? So you have land around the edge, and then in the center you have water again. That's an atoll. And Bikini Atoll is just one of those in the Marshall Islands. It is where we get the name for the type of swimwear. Now, if you have ever spent any time in one of Mr. Kaufman's classes, he has an example he likes to use regarding early swimwear and all that jazz. So if you've seen pictures of an early bikini, they are not what they are today. They were not what they are today. So anyway, this is where we get the name for that. Just a little fun fact. But the U.S. drops the first H-bomb out in the middle of the Marshall Islands. That is a picture from Time magazine. That was the cover of Time magazine at the time. And as you can see, again, it's a very large mushroom cloud, very large explosion again. Well, the Soviets explode their own thermonuclear weapon in August of 1953. So it takes them a little while longer, but they do eventually get it, and not too far behind the United States. Now, something to keep in mind, we already talked about the election of 1952, but something to keep in mind is that, I'm going to go back real quick, we exploded the first hydrogen bomb in November 1st, 1952. Well, in this country, we usually vote for president not too long after that. And so the election of 1952 happens just days after that explosion of the hydrogen bomb. We've already gone over this, that the Republican Eisenhower defeats Adlai Stevenson in a landslide. You can see the electoral map there. Eisenhower takes 83% of the electoral votes. He wins the popular vote by 55%, so he has a majority. He has not just a plurality, which just means one more than the other person. He has a majority. He has over 50% of the popular vote. He has well over 50% of the electoral vote. It is a landslide win for the Republican Party and loss for the Democrats. And Eisenhower is going to take office in January. So remember, we vote in November, but the new president doesn't take office until January. Eisenhower takes office in January. So Eisenhower is president. He becomes president when only the United States has dropped an H-bomb, but he will be president when the Soviets drop their hydrogen bomb. And so now, by August of the first year of his presidency, right? So he's becomes president in January. By August, he is now having to decide how to proceed in a world where both nations now have this massively powerful bomb, right? And he's having to figure out how that's going to work. So let's see what he does. The first thing he does is he hires John Foster Dulles to be his Secretary of State. Remember, Secretary of State is supposed to be the guy who handles diplomats and diplomatic relations. He's the guy who is supposed to handle the United States relationship with other countries and their diplomatic relations or their kind of friendly business type relationships with these other countries. You don't normally think of him as the guy who's planning military strategy and whatnot, but that is going to become what he does. Dulles himself is staunchly anti-communist. He considers himself an anti-communist crusader. He hates communism, and he is going to go after it as much as he can. And so he proposes this new policy to deal with the spread of communism, and this policy becomes known as brinkmanship. Okay, and so brinkmanship is a policy of being willing to use all force, including nukes, against any aggressor nation to stop the spread of communism. If you remember, we talked about Truman's policy was containment, right? The Truman Doctrine being that they were going to support any nation who came under threat. They were going to contain the spread of communism. And now brinkmanship is saying not only are we going to contain communism, we are going to stop the spread using any force necessary, and that includes nuclear weapons. We are not afraid to use nuclear weapons. And so brinkmanship basically calls for a reduction in the size of the Army and Navy and an expansion of the Air Force. Now, if you're asking yourself, why would we need to reduce the Army and Navy? Why would we expand the Air Force? It makes sense when you think of it this way. Nuclear bombs have to be delivered somehow, right? We currently, in the 1950s, we're not launching them. We don't have intercontinental ballistic missiles where we can launch them from, land in the United States and shoot them over somewhere and have them land where we want them to. In the 1950s, the only way we know how to deliver a nuke is by putting it on a plane, flying that plane where we want to drop it, and dropping it. So we don't need an Army and a Navy so much if we are going to be relying on these nuclear bombs. We need more planes, we need more pilots. So we are reducing the Army and the Navy so we can spend less money there. We're expanding the Air Force so we have more pilots and more planes to deliver these bombs, right? This becomes brinkmanship. This is what Eisenhower and the American government decide to do. And the Soviets actually follow suit. The Soviets do a similar thing, and they make similar moves within their military, okay? And so as these tensions rise, and the US is shifting to this dependence on nuclear arms, Eisenhower is also going to begin to rely more heavily on covert actions, spying. And this is where the CIA really comes into play. And this is one of my favorite topics to talk about because it's something that we never talk about. When I was in school, when I was in history classes in high school, we never talked about this. I did not know the things that I'm about to share with you when I was in high school. And I think it's important that you do. One of the things we're kind of bad at as a society is admitting when we're wrong. Nobody likes to be wrong. Nobody likes to admit when they're wrong. And that has bled over into our politics and our country. Nobody likes to admit when their political favorites are wrong or when they've done something wrong. Nobody likes to admit when the country has done something wrong. There's somehow this belief that we have to be almost blindly loyal. And that if we admit that we did something wrong, somehow that's going to hurt us in the long run. And I don't think that's the case. We teach children to apologize from a very early age. We teach people that it's better to reconcile, right? We teach conflict resolution. And one of those first steps is admitting when you're wrong. And so this is one of those topics that I love because if we teach it, hopefully we as a society can become better, right? Remember, my goal is to make everyone better citizens. Hopefully, if we learn how to say we were wrong and apologize, things can get better. So here we go. Let's look at this. So originally, the CIA existed before it was the CIA. It was originally the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. That's not from Spy Kids. That's the real thing. And that existed from 1942 to 1945-ish. I put a question mark because everything with the CIA or any sort of covert operation is pretty hard to nail down details for some of these things because they're meant to be top secret. They're meant to be unknown to the public. So it's kind of hard to nail some of these things down, but we can pretty much date the CIA as it currently exists, as we know the CIA. We can date that to about 1947. And so when Eisenhower is president, starting in 1953, Allen Dulles is going to become the head of the CIA. And that's not just a coincidence. This is John Foster Dulles' brother. So you have the two Dulles brothers. One is Secretary of State. The other is the head of the CIA. That is not by coincidence. That is not on accident. It's not just, fun happenstance. This is absolutely intentional on Eisenhower's part. He now has these two brothers. They very similar mindsets, and they're in arguably two of the most powerful positions in the country to fight this Cold War. And so Allen Dulles is going to run the CIA. And the CIA, we talk a lot about it, but really by definition, the CIA is a covert organization that uses spies to carry out covert operations to weaken or overthrow governments unfriendly to the United States. That really is the purpose of the CIA. It is meant to protect the country. It's meant to carry out these spy, missions, if you will, to protect the United States from enemy nations. But when you say it like that, it sounds very much like a defensive thing, right? Like there's a threat to the country and therefore the CIA intervenes. But what we know is the reality of the situation is during the Cold War, the CIA is very much an offensive weapon. It's very much a secret military, if you will, for Eisenhower and the rest of the country. And there are two covert operations that I want to talk about. And I'm so sad that we're doing this online because, in particular, one of these is part of one of my favorite topics to talk about, and that is U.S. intervention in Latin America. And I really wish we had the time in class to go over it, but we don't. So we're going to keep going. But we're going to look at the Middle East first. So in Iran in 1953, we're going to backtrack first to 1951. In 1951, the Iranian Prime Minister, Mossadegh, nationalized Iran's oil fields, meaning he took possession of them from this Anglo-Iranian oil company, which today, the Anglo-Iranian oil company is a part of British Petroleum, or BP. So if you've gone to like Arco, places like that, if you see that BP logo, it's kind of green, almost looks like a rising sun kind of thing. Anywhere you see BP, right, that's British Petroleum. And the Anglo-Iranian oil company was a part of that, is a smaller piece of BP. And so in 1951, the Anglo-Iranian oil company, or basically the English British Petroleum in Iran, ran all of the oil production in Iran. In 1951, the prime minister is going to nationalize it, meaning that the government of Iran is going to take over all of the oil production. And that makes the British mad, right? This hurts their industry. This is a privately owned company that is owned by the British, and they're mad about it. So they stopped buying oil in protest. And so this is Mossadegh. This is the prime minister. The Iranian economy, as a result of the British not purchasing this oil from them, the Iranian economy, begins to falter. And the U.S. is afraid that if Iran and their economy fails, they will be drawn to communism. Remember, we talked about this in an earlier lecture. There is this inherent belief amongst Americans and the American government that poor nations are the most susceptible to communism. If the nation is wealthy and has a good economy, they're not going to go to communism. They're going to love democracy. That's just, and capitalism. That's this belief that the Americans have. So when the Iranian economy starts tanking, the Americans get worried. And so in 1953, the CIA under Dulles gives millions of dollars to an anti-Mossadegh group of supporters that back the Shah. That's this gentleman here on the right. The Shah is the monarch, the former monarch of Iran. So prior to having a prime minister and a democratic government, they had a monarch. They had a king or a Shah. So pause right there. Iran in the 1950s has a democratic government. They have this prime minister, not unlike the current English parliament system. But the Americans are afraid that he is not going to be strong enough to resist the temptation of communism. And so the American CIA gives money to anti-democratic protesters. They back a monarch. They want to go back to a monarchy. They want the Shah back in power. And so the Shah and his backers lead a coup d'etat. They overthrow the prime minister of Iran, and the Shah comes back into power. And he, once he's back in power, turns control of all of Iran's oil fields back over to Western companies. He no longer nationalizes them. The Iranian government is no longer in charge of them. He gives them back to Western companies. So digest this with me. You have a democratically elected leader, not unlike our president, not unlike the prime minister and all the representatives in parliament in Great Britain, not unlike our local officials, right? These are publicly elected people. In this case, the Prime Minister Mossadegh. And the American government, the CIA, is going to back a monarchy to overthrow a democratically elected leader in Iran. It doesn't seem to fit with our political beliefs. It doesn't seem to fit with our political philosophy, but we did it. And we didn't just do it in Iran. We're going to look at Guatemala now. So in Guatemala, and in Latin America in particular, a very old company is the United Fruit Company. This is an American company. The United Fruit Company is an American company that has spread out all throughout Latin America, and they have taken up most of the farmland in a lot of these Latin American countries. And so they are American-owned companies that now privately own this land in places like Guatemala, and they're growing these crops. In this case, bananas and other fruits, coffee, other major exports that make them a lot of money. They sell them back into the United States. Americans are buying them like crazy. And then not only that, we're turning around and selling them internationally and selling them back to places like Guatemala. And so instead of Guatemalan people making money off of their land and this produce, they're having to buy their own produce back from these American companies. So in the 1950s, the Guatemalan government has an election, and this gentleman, Jacobo Arbenz, is elected. He's elected by the people in an election that is fair, that is not, there's no interference. We know that this is a fair election, right? But Eisenhower is afraid that Arbenz has communist sympathies. And he reaches this conclusion because Arbenz, when he comes to power, he realizes just how much land these American companies, in particular the United Fruit Company, how much land they own inside of Guatemala and how much money they're making off of Guatemalan land that these poor peasants within Guatemala could be farming on their own, right? He has an issue. He comes to power, and his country is suffering from record unemployment and poverty. And he says, well, here's all this land here. Why don't we take this land back, give it back to the Guatemalan people, and let them make the money off of it rather than living hungry? So from the time Arbenz comes into power, he seizes more than 200,000 acres of American company-owned land and redistributes it to the poor. Let me say that again. He seizes or nationalizes 200,000 acres of farmland that was owned by American companies like United Fruit Company, and he redistributes them to the poor, to Guatemalans who are going to farm it now themselves. And so Eisenhower, when this happens, Eisenhower thinks, oh my gosh, this guy must be a communist. He took the land away. He's redistributing the land. Oh my goodness. Now, the reality is that he's also hurting a major American corporation, and these American corporations, like United Fruit Company, have a lot of political influence. They have a lot of people who can go to Washington and put pressure on government officials and put pressure on Eisenhower to get them their land back, right? It's essentially, it's that bratty child going and crying to daddy that somebody took something that they had already stolen from somebody else anyway, right? It's bad. It's a bad look for America. But nonetheless, Eisenhower has this fear, so he turns to Dulles and the CIA, and the CIA goes down to Guatemala and works to train an army of 480 insurgents led by this man there on the left, the gentleman on the left, Carlos Castillo Armas. And here's a picture of Carlos Castillo Armas with, hopefully you recognize him. The gentleman on the right there is Richard Nixon, Vice President Richard Nixon. And so the CIA is going to train these soldiers, these 480 soldiers led by Carlos Castillo Armas, and they are going to launch, on top of this, the CIA is also going to launch psychological warfare tactics along with an invasion. So not only, so the Americans are going to start running like ads, radio ads, taking over radio waves, taking over messages, and along with that, Carlos Castillo Armas is going to lead these soldiers in an invasion. The invasion goes poorly, terrible, but the psychological warfare that they employ makes the Guatemalan army fearful. And they stop defending Arbenz. The army becomes afraid that the U.S. is going to invade, right? That this little insurgency, this 480 person army, they were nothing. That was just the first step. The Americans must be coming next. And so they stopped supporting Arbenz. And on June 27th, 1954, Arbenz is forced to resign, and a military junta, or a military a small group of military leaders, they take over the country. Eventually, Carlos Castillo Armas is installed as the dictator of Guatemala, and he is the first in a series of U.S.-backed authoritarian rulers in Guatemala. This is another situation where a democratically elected leader, Jacobo Arbenz, is overthrown by an American-backed, American CIA-backed covert operation, and a dictator is put in place instead, right? Again, this doesn't seem to fit the American, what we like to think of as the American way of doing things, or the American belief in how to do things. But that it is what it is. That is what is happening in Guatemala and in Iran, okay? On top of this, not on top of this, but at the same time, you end up with this kind of short-lived, short-term, temporary thawing of relations with the Soviet Union. Things start to heat up a little bit instead of being so cold, right? The first is that Stalin dies, right? March 5th, 1953, Stalin succumbs to some cerebral hemorrhaging he had on March 1st. He dies a very slow, agonizing death in those 4 days, but he is dead. And his death signals a thawing of U.S.-Soviet relations. Not immediately, but very shortly after this, the Soviets end up recognizing West Germany as a sovereign nation. This is a big deal. Remember, West Germany, the U.S. set up a government there, called it West Germany, and now the Soviets are going to officially recognize that government as sovereign, which means that they are recognizing them as a legitimate country all their own, right? The other thing they're going to do is they're going to form peace treaties with Austria and Japan. Why is this a big deal? Because remember, in World War II, the Soviet Union was fighting Germany and Japan as well. They declared war on both, and now they're finally, after Stalin dies by 1953, they're finally establishing peace treaties with both of those countries. So things seem to be looking a little better. They seem to be looking on the bright side a little bit. Then things kind of get interesting. In 1955, now that the Soviet Union has recognized West Germany as sovereign, the United States, Canada, and the other nations of NATO go ahead and they allow West Germany to not only rearm, meaning form their own military and start building a military again, but they also allow them to join NATO. And the Soviet Union they grow fearful of this because now you have a West Germany that is armed again and backed by these other powerful nations right there on the border of what is now East Germany, right? And if you remember, Berlin is part of this, and Berlin is split in half. And so there's a West Berlin that is part of West Germany and is now getting rearmed. And so the Soviets are fearful of this, and they decide that they need to move forward and form their own military alliance to combat NATO. And they do. It's called the Warsaw Pact, and it's made up of the Soviet Union and 7 other Eastern European nations. Okay, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. Okay, so basically this becomes, the Warsaw Pact becomes what we would consider, or what we would call the Soviet bloc, right? Or we refer to them as satellites earlier. These are the satellite nations of the Soviet Union, or basically what we would call the Soviet bloc. Warsaw Pact countries are now aligned with the Soviet Union. So you can see in that map there, that map is from 1960. So it's about 5 years later, but it's pretty much the same as 1955. You can see all of those orange countries are Warsaw Pact countries. All of the green ones are NATO countries, and obviously the United States and Canada aren't on that map. That's just Europe, but it's all of those green ones plus the United States and Canada. And so now we have, again, we already kind of had two sides, but now we officially have two sides of this coin, right? That Iron Curtain is now officially dividing NATO from the Warsaw Pact countries. Not too long after the formation of the Warsaw Pact, Eisenhower and the Soviet Union and other leaders are going to meet in Geneva, Switzerland. Okay, July 1955, they're going to meet in Geneva, Switzerland, and they're going to start having these conversations about, arms, the arms race, trying to lessen the arms race, trying to come to an agreement, right? Now that Stalin's dead, it's looking like things are going to maybe get better. And so Eisenhower proposes an arms reduction agreement called Open Skies. Open Skies is funny. I'm going to try to explain it briefly, but basically what it was Eisenhower comes to the Soviets and says, here, we'd like to enter into this arms deal, and what this is going to allow us to do is we'll exchange maps. The United States and the Soviets will each exchange maps, and these maps are going to show all of our military installations and everywhere where we have nuclear weapons held, right? We'll give you a map of ours, you give us a map of yours, and then what we're allowed to do is we're allowed to send planes to fly over your country and, using the map, make sure that everything is where you say it is and that there's nothing else out there, right? Now, this is a crazy plan. What country is going to agree to tell the other one all the locations of their military outposts and everything, give them a map to them, and then say, sure, go ahead, fly over my country and look, right? Again, this is a time of massive fear of bombings. No country is going to agree to this. And Eisenhower knows that. It's not a real deal. The Soviets are not expected to actually take this deal. Okay, you have to understand that this is very much a political move, but by doing this, by being the one to put this plan out there, Eisenhower knows that as soon as the Soviets reject it, they look like the aggressors, right? They look like the ones that are keeping this thing going. It makes it look like the Americans are trying to look for peace and good solutions, and it's the Soviets who are just going to keep this fight going. And so the Soviets reject it. Eisenhower comes out and says that the spirit of Geneva, or basically the feeling that they had while they were there at this meeting, is a step towards peace. It's all going well. But Eisenhower has a secret in his back pocket that we'll talk about in a minute. It's not all butterflies and rainbows, okay? So right about the same time, 1955, we get another international crisis, if you will, that pulls the United States into some positions because they're afraid of how the Soviets are going to react. So in 1955, the US and Great Britain offered the government of Egypt funds to build a dam along the Nile River. Now, Aswan is further south in Egypt. It's closer to their border with Sudan. But it's further down there, and not in the picture you see on the map, because this dam at Aswan is really not that important. What's important is that the Egyptian government under Gamal Abdel Nasser, they decide that they're going to take this deal and they're going to try and parlay it, or they're going to try and get more from it. So they go to the Soviets and they say, hey, the United States and Great Britain are offering us this much money to build this dam. What would you give us, right? It's like that child who goes and asks mom for a cookie. Mom says no. So he goes and asks dad, right? Except in this case, it's, hey, mom said I could have a cookie. Will you let me have 2 cookies? And we don't really know or care how the Soviets reacted. What we know is Dulles, Secretary of State Dulles, right? So this is not the head of the CIA. This is John Foster Dulles, the head of the Secretary of State. In 1956, he finds out that they went to the Soviets and tried to get this better deal. So he withdraws the U.S. offer. Okay, he says, fine, the money's off the table. We're not giving you the money. So the Egyptian government responds by nationalizing, or again, taking over the Suez Canal, a waterway that's owned by the French and the British. If you look at the map here, right, here's the Mediterranean Sea. The Red Sea is down here, it looks like a snail, right? This is the Gulf of Suez, and here is the Suez Canal. So it's this canal that the British and the French operate, and it's a way of shipping stuff from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, right? It's a great way of getting items to Israel, is really what it comes down to, okay? As well as other places on the Mediterranean, but pay attention to Israel for a minute, okay? And so they're going to nationalize this, which means that the French and the British company that is running, and the government companies that are running this canal, now are losing out on that canal revenue and losing out on using it. And the Egyptians also refuse to let any ships bound for Israel use the canal. Okay. So in response, Israel, Great Britain, and France are going to send troops, and they're going to seize this northern portion of the canal along the Mediterranean Sea. They're going to seize this portion away from the Egyptian government. Creates a standoff, and the United Nations eventually steps in and persuades Great Britain, France, and Israel to stop the fighting and allows Egypt to keep control of the canal. Now, this is a huge deal because the United States didn't do anything, right? The United States isn't responding. And the last time this happened was China, right? The last time that communists or suspected communists were allowed to just succeed and the United States did nothing was China. And if you remember, the American people lost favor for Truman because they figured, oh, well, look, Truman let them win. So Eisenhower doesn't want to appear weak. He doesn't want to repeat the mistake that Truman made. And he needs to combat this Soviet prestige in the Middle East, right? These Middle Eastern companies think that they can turn to the Soviet Union and use them to get a better deal. So in January of 1957, Eisenhower issues this statement that the U.S. will defend the Middle East against any attack by a communist country. And this idea that any communist attack by any attack by a communist country in the Middle East, the United States is immediately going to come and defend them. This becomes known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. It's adopted in March of that year by Congress, and this becomes the Eisenhower Doctrine. So if the Truman Doctrine was that we were going to give money and support nations because poor nations are susceptible to falling to communism, the Eisenhower Doctrine is if a communist country attacks, we're attacking back. Okay, and this is key, right? Eisenhower is putting his foot down, saying, "Look, no, we're not weak. We're going to do this." And so we're going to find out what's going to happen. That's a lesson for another time. We'll talk about the Middle East more in the next unit. But sticking with the Soviet Union and this kind of era of thawing, there's going to be an uprising in Hungary. Okay, now, before we get to the uprising in Hungary, something I need you to understand, kind of some background. The gentleman who is going to take over when Stalin dies, we're going to talk about him in a minute. His name is Nikita Khrushchev. We'll talk about him actually in a little bit after we talk about this. But you have to understand that Nikita Khrushchev gets up and he gives this speech in February of 1956, and he condemns Stalin. He says that everything Stalin did was not good, that that's not really the true way of the Soviet Union, that all the violence, all the killing that Stalin did, that's not his way. This forcing people to do what he wants, that was bad. And, that's not the way the Soviet Union's going to be. And really what he's doing is he's trying to test the waters. He's trying to see which Soviet bloc countries are going to stay loyal, which ones are going to like this message. And as it turns out, kind of an unexpected consequence is countries start to rebel. Because if they hear Khrushchev saying that Stalin's tactics were bad, that must mean that they're not going to use them. So in October of 1956, Poland has an uprising. They have an uprising, but they don't get rid of communism. All they do is they get rid of the Soviet-backed leaders. They have this uprising in Poland in October. These more conservative, what we would call reformist communists take over, and they take control of Poland. So Poland's still technically communist, and they're not trying to pull out of the Warsaw Pact, so the Soviet Union's okay with it. At the same time, in October of 1956, the Hungarians see this, and they think, well, Poland did it, we can do it. And so the Hungarian people revolt against the Soviets in Hungary. The difference is that this gentleman, the gentleman pictured here, Imre Nagy, he and his fellow Hungarians actually form a new government. And this new government calls for free elections, and they denounce the Warsaw Pact. So they are saying, we are not only not having you Soviets, we are going to form a democratic government with free elections. We don't want to be part of the Warsaw Pact, and we're going to demand that Soviet troops leave Hungary, right? This is clearly a step beyond what the Polish people did, right? The Polish people just said, hey, we want different communists in power, and we just want them to be Polish communists. We don't want them to be Russian communists. So we cool? We're cool. The Hungarians are like, no, we want a whole new government. We want free elections. The Soviet Union can't have that. It makes them look weak, right? If these Hungarian people are able to get rid of them. So the Soviets respond in November of 1956. They send in tanks and end up killing about 30,000 Hungarians. They overthrow Nagy and his government. They execute him, and they install a pro-Soviet government once again. Roughly, because of this, roughly 200,000 Hungarians flee Hungary and move west. Now, again, why are they moving west? Because of that Iron Curtain divide, right? We are looking at the division of East and West in Europe. West represents democracy and liberties, and the East is the Soviet bloc. It's under that Soviet control, that communist control, and so they are fleeing from that. And so roughly 200,000 Hungarians flee west. And again, the United States does nothing. Right? The message is clear that containment only matters and only applies to other countries. The Eisenhower Doctrine is about the Middle East, right? These countries that aren't part of the Soviet bloc. The CIA is operating in places and overthrowing governments in places where that are not part of the Soviet bloc. And so the message is clear that when these Soviet bloc countries try and resist communism, they're on their own, right? The US is not going to intervene in that situation. And not only that, the UN is not going to do anything because of the Soviet Union. They're in that Security Council. They have a veto. And so the Soviets are able to block any UN actions with their veto. So the message is very clear to these Soviet bloc countries that they are on their own. If they are going to overthrow the Soviets, if they're going to get rid of Soviet communism in their countries, they're on their own. Nobody is coming to their aid. There's a lot of good material. Again, if we were in class, I would take the time to show you all these books. I have a lot of great books about these Soviet bloc countries under the oppression of the Soviets, and you can read these stories of bread lines and of people starving, and this hopeless feeling they have, this reality. These are true accounts of people who survived this reality that when they become aware that there's nothing the Western world can do, that the United States is not going to come and help them, that the United Nations cannot come help them, that they are on their own against the Soviet Union. And the desperation that arises is heartbreaking. And I wish we had more time to go into it, but alas, we don't. So we're going to move on to the last piece of today, and this is the final place of kind of this early Cold War tension, and that is in the space race. So I mentioned him a minute ago. I want to talk a little bit more about him now. When Stalin dies in 1953, there was no clear plan within the Soviet Union for succession. There was no clear plan for who was going to take over as the new dictator, right? The new head man of the Soviet Union. And so what ends up happening is this small group of members of the Communist Party, members of the Politburo, they take over together as a group. But this man, Nikita Khrushchev, he is going to be the one that's kind of informally leading this group, right? He kind of rises to be the top guy in the group. But by 1958, it's very clear he is the sole guy in charge. He's able to consolidate his power, and he takes over the office of the premier, the former office of Stalin, right? So now, by 1958, Khrushchev is alone at the top of the Soviet Union. And something you have to know about Khrushchev is that he is a loyal old Bolshevik, right? He is long-term. He's been with the Bolsheviks since they were the Bolsheviks, right? He's been with the Communist Party since they were the Bolsheviks. Now they're the communists. He was one of Stalin's closest advisors. He has been around. He is well known, and the Soviets trust him tremendously. But he is not like Joseph Stalin. He was one of Stalin's closest advisors, but he does not believe in the same tactics as Stalin. I told you that he comes out in February of 1956, right? He gives a speech, in fact, condemning Stalin. As soon as Stalin's dead, more or less, the Soviet Union starts trying to backtrack away from these tactics of Stalin, right? The known brutalities. And Khrushchev favors, when it comes to the United States, he favors a policy of peaceful coexistence. He's trying to just make the Soviet Union a global superpower like the United States. He wants them to coexist and kind of basically, hey, you let us do our thing, we let you do your thing. And instead of competing with each other in these proxy wars, instead of continuing to fight each other this way, where we're going to compete is economically and scientifically, right? let's let our economic policies speak for themselves. We'll figure out whose is best that way, and let's compete scientifically. And that's the key here for Khrushchev. Khrushchev is going to be critical to pushing the Soviet space exploration programs. And in October of 1957, the Soviets are going to be the ones that launched the first artificial satellite into orbit. Sputnik #1, you can see it right there. That's what it looked like. It spent a couple days out in orbit around the planet before its batteries died. It spent a couple more days out there floating around, no batteries, and then eventually it fell back through into the atmosphere and came back. The US is embarrassed, right? The Soviets have beat them to outer space. Space becomes the obsession of the United States. It becomes this, again, this final frontier, right? We're the country that settled the West, right? We spread from the 13 colonies all the way across this land. And as we've talked about, of course, we stole this land from a lot of people and we killed a lot of people, and it's all bad. But put yourself in the mindset of somebody who believes in this, right? Put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's all about this manifest destiny that the United States was meant to have all this land, and now the final frontier, right? We've conquered the Western frontier. Now the final frontier is space. What's out there? And the Soviets have beat us to space. So Eisenhower is embarrassed. He starts pushing on space exploration, starts pushing for the United States to get there. And finally, in January of 1958, the end of January 1958, the U.S. is able to launch its first artificial satellite into orbit, Explorer 1. You can see a picture of it there. Kind of funny looking rocket with these little antennas, right? And from there, the space race is only going to continue. It will continue more so under Kennedy, which we will look at in the next unit. But not only is space the final frontier, but now we're looking at the skies again, right? We talked about this. We're increasing our Air Force. The sky itself has become this frontier land for the Americans. And there's going to be this incident with a U-2 plane. No, not these guys, but these guys. This is a picture of a U-2 plane. It is a U-2 spy plane. It's a very lightweight, very relatively small plane. You'll see a picture of a person standing next to it. It's not really this huge plane. But following the rejection of open skies, right? We talked about this just a few minutes ago. 1955, Eisenhower proposes this open skies initiative with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union rejects it. The CIA begins making secret high altitude flights over Soviet territory, right? So it's not an agreement. These are top secret spy missions where these U-2 planes, they were capable of flying at high altitudes without being detected, right? So they wouldn't show up on radar or anything like that. And they were equipped with infrared cameras to take detailed photos of the ground below. And so the US and the CIA started launching these U-2 planes regularly to take pictures over Soviet territory so that they could compare the pictures as time went on. They have a time lapse basically of photos, and that would allow the Americans to track troop movements, missile locations, and how the Soviet Union and how the Soviet satellite states were coming along in their production, right? And by 1960, it's very clear that the U-2 program is drawing more concerns than it's worth. One, it's not a secret anymore. The US press knows about it, which means that the public knows about it. The Soviets knew about the flight since at least 1958, right? Some reports even show that they were capable of tracking these flights with radar now, and that they had been firing surface-to-air missiles at them, right? Trying to hit them. And number three, Eisenhower wants the program ended because he has a summit meeting with Khrushchev scheduled for May 15, 1960, right, to discuss the arms race. So he wants this shut down. He doesn't want to run the risk of getting caught. But John Foster Dulles convinces him to make one more flight. So Eisenhower signs off on it. He allows for one more flight, and that flight ends up creating what is known as the U-2 incident. May 1st, 1960, Francis Gary Powers, an American pilot, is shot down in his U-2 plane in Soviet airspace 4 hours into his flight. So he's 4 hours in. He's been taking plenty of pictures this whole time. He parachutes out of the plane and is captured by the Soviets, but the CIA doesn't know that. They assume he's dead. These planes are lightweight. Again, they're spy planes. They're meant to explode on impact because, again, if you're putting spies out there, you don't want spies getting caught, because spies getting caught looks bad for you, right? And they could talk. So the idea was that nobody would survive these things. If they got blown up, they blew up. He was supposed to be dead. He lives. The Americans don't know that. So the Soviets come out and they announce that they shot down this plane, right? This American U-2 plane. And the CIA comes out and claims, no, it wasn't a U-2 plane. It was a weather plane. That's it. Then the Soviets say, no, it wasn't. And they show proof to the world that it was a U-2 plane. So Eisenhower comes out and says, okay, you're right. It was a U-2 plane. It wasn't a weather plane. But don't worry, it was just a civilian U-2 plane, drifted into Soviet airspace when the pilot lost consciousness. It's just a big misunderstanding, right? This wasn't government. It was a private citizen. And then the Soviets come out with the kicker and they say, no, that's also a lie because the pilot's alive. We captured the pilot alive. And so Eisenhower is forced to admit that, yes, in fact, the U.S. was still making these flights, that the U.S. was in the middle of this flight on May 1st, even though the summit was coming. And the U.S. claims that it's because it needed intel, right? That the Soviets had, denied them intel and they needed it. And so Khrushchev demands an apology and an end to the U-2 program. Eisenhower refuses to apologize again, saying that, this was necessary. And so Khrushchev ends up canceling the summit. And this is how we are going to end today. Here's pictures. You have Francis Gary Powers there. You have an American newspaper headline. This is how relations between the Soviet Union and the Americans, this is where they're at in 1960, when we are going to get a new president, right? So if you were tracking the election of 52, Eisenhower's elected, he's reelected in 56. And so now there's going to be an election in 1960, and we will cover that in the next unit. So thanks for being with me today. I'm going to go ahead and shut off the recording and we can chat.